experience of the Corbyn years has given us great visibility that we didn't have beforehand. You know, we were told beforehand that left-wing ideas were marginal, they were unpopular, you couldn't build a majoritarian programme and campaign around them, that the power of the media was too great, and so on and so forth. And actually what we learned was kind of the opposite, that and it's given us lots of visibility. And we can see that an agenda which is more radical than where we had got to in 2019 on a whole range of things has supermajority support. You know, wealth tax, we basically didn't really, we had, you know, small little policies in the direction of the wealth tax, we didn't have a proper wealth tax. You know, that is supermajority support. Majority of Tory voters in polls would support a wealth tax. £15 an hour minimum wage is a majority position. In fact, it's nearly 2/3 of the public support it. You know, that's further than where we were in 2019. Taking gig work companies into public ownership if they abuse their workers, that is again, overwhelmingly majority position in the public. Lots of things, requisitioning homes for homeless people. They're quite seemingly radical things are actually the common sense of where most people are. And we should take great confidence in that, and it has shown us that. But it's also given us, we can see that there is a very big potential constituency which is getting bigger and its need is getting greater. Well, it's potentially getting bigger, but its need is getting greater as living standards are crushed. But the different forces within it, the trade unions are in a much stronger position than they were 8 years ago, and there are more people, all of the people here and beyond, who have been part of political campaigns, network together, who have a greater degree of skills and capacities which could be applied to future campaigns, some future project. So the correct question, I think, having started with saying what's the wrong question, is how do we unite, mobilise and organise this base when we don't have a political voice, when there is no political leadership? How do you bring together a formation when there's no tip of the spear? We had a clear strategic horizon and a clear leadership. There was Corbyn, he was the leader of the Labour Party, the strategic horizon was get Labour elected and him to be Prime Minister, very simple. Now we don't have that, we don't have anyone who can even go on TV and say, no, we should have public ownership of energy, which is apparently you're not allowed to say on TV despite it being something like 70% of the public support. So I argue that what we need is to bring together the political, industrial and social lefts into a formal alliance that can fill the void left by not having a political party that can play that role. We still need something to play that role, but right now it isn't going to be an electoral vehicle for the reasons that I said before. That's not to say that we don't want an electoral vehicle eventually, whether it's got a Labour rose on it or not is kind of by the by. And it's so to bring together these things, that's talking about the left in the various parliaments, in the Scottish Parliament, in Westminster, in Wales, in town halls, mayors, and so on, with the remaining Labour left, with the grassroots left in organisations outside the Labour Party, like People's Assembly, with the left trade unions that are on, well, that may or may not be on strike, with the left in trade unions that aren't led from the left, with, crucially, the climate movement, and to unite the cost of living crisis with the climate crisis. That, as one of the Gilets Jaunes protesters had a really great sign which said, basically, the end of the month and the end of the world, same struggle. And bringing those forces together is, I think, crucial for building our base to advance. And once these things are brought together, our focus should be on actions in the real world, not saying things, because we don't have a pulpit in order to say things unless we're doing something. So, why is it that Mick Lynch could speak for millions and millions and millions of people and be so popular and so successful? Because they had to give him basically round-the-clock media coverage because real people were doing a real thing in the real world that was disrupting things. So it was something that has to be covered, which means an opening is created to say things. And it's only at those moments can that broaden out to providing a more general critique of what is going on, not just the sectoral interests of one particular industrial dispute or one particular campaign, regardless of how big and broad and important those are, into a general critique and a set of solutions that people can grab onto and demand. Now all of that, once you've got those different bits together, that could end up with a political party. That political party could be Labour. They could all get kicked out of Labour, and then they would have to set up another party, but you'd be doing that with, 24 MPs, 5, 8, 10 trade unions, Extinction Rebellion, some Black Lives Matter groups and so on. So you would be doing it with an organised social base, probably a couple 100,000 members, and then you've got an ability to act in our electoral system. But with that, without that, I don't think you do. But we don't know what's going to be. Part of the thing I argue in the book is we don't know what is going to happen at all. Contingency really matters. If, what's his name? Eric Joyce. If Eric Joyce hadn't punched a Tory MP in a Commons bar in 2013, Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have been leader of the Labour Party. We wouldn't be having, Morning Star would be having a conference, but we wouldn't be, we wouldn't be having this debate right now. We wouldn't have just lived through the last few years. So contingency really matters. And so I guess I've probably run over. So I'll just end with saying, whatever influence anybody here has on any of the bits of the left where they are, I would call on you to call on the people that you can influence to bring together into some much more coherent coordination the unions that are currently fighting. They're fighting for their members. They're doing a fantastic job, but it needs to broaden into a wider uprising with the Socialist Campaign Group, who desperately need to be organised into a shadow opposition like the Labour right had against us and like the Continuity Remain campaigns had against us. It really isn't that difficult, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't be 3 years on and not have it. That needs to happen. And to work with Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, who want to do this. Their politics have moved tremendously over the last 4 years or so, and are very keen to engage in this kind of broad-based alliance which knits together cost of living and climate with trade unions, with the existing left. And I think if we do that, each campaign, each action will be stronger, will be enhanced by the others, and that will get the social solutions back into the public debate, back into popularity, and from that we don't know what vehicle will come, but we know that the world is going on, as it is going on like this, it can't carry on, and that will provide some kind of political opening, and we're far more likely to be able to take it if we brought together all of our various forces so that they can be on the same pitch at the same time.
I think, as was touched on there, large sections of the left and of the Labour movement are confused and paralysed even about how the political class struggle is to be fought post-Corbyn, and in the face of the right-wing crusade that we've just heard outlined, and that's a crusade that's of course led by one of the chief architects of that defeat for the Labour left, Keir Starmer. On the one hand, I think we face a lot of apathy, and on the other hand, we have people advocating what are essentially dead-end paths for the struggle for socialism here in Britain. But I think that we also, at the outset, need to be clear and confident that that defeat, that was a temporary reversal, and it was just that, it was temporary. There's no such thing as a permanent defeat in the struggle for socialism, no matter how much the ruling class might dream of it. And as well as putting the word socialism back in the mainstream of the political agenda and discussions that were taking place among working people up and down the country, I think it's fair to say that the Corbyn project really electrified an entire generation of young people and won them to left politics in general terms. And they haven't gone away. And it's one of the key challenges for the left, is how do we maintain and mobilise these people and avoid losing them to apathy. So what situation do we face here in Britain, and more importantly, where do we go from here? Capitalism in Britain, and indeed around the world, is in crisis. For working people, it's a bankrupted system, economically, ideologically and morally. As we all know from our own communities, living conditions for working people everywhere are plummeting on every front. We've got a Tory government that's more and more resorting to anti-democratic measures, anti-minority rhetoric, and stoking the sort of US-style culture wars that we're seeing just now. But they're doing that because they are in a weakened state, and they know that they're under threat in the face of a lot of popular resistance. The Labour Party under Keir Starmer doesn't represent a fundamental alternative for working people at present. Even if they were to defeat the Tories tomorrow, on their current platform, that wouldn't really represent a meaningful victory for most working people up and down Britain. I think I would have been about 3 at the time, so I can't provide a measured or good opinion, but I would imagine when Blair got in for the first time, there might have been similar feelings to how a lot of folk are feeling just now on the left. But there is no reason for despondency, and I think as a left we can't allow any time for lamentations. You know, there are many reasons to be hopeful. First and foremost, as we're all aware, and as was touched on by the previous speaker, we are seeing a rising wave of industrial militancy in every corner of Britain today. Now that's something that has to be supported, galvanised and broadened from the current battles over pay to a movement for trade union freedom, first and foremost, and also a movement that can defeat the Tories and win a pro-worker government here in Britain. Trade unions are growing again after decades of malaise and the adoption of partnership ideology. And what we're seeing just now is that they're capturing the imagination and support of working people who aren't involved in the labour movement yet. And we're seeing similar exciting developments in tenants and students and peace movements. So wherever working people are prepared to stand up and fight, we're seeing that there is always hope, and that's not something that's changed. And as was touched on in the last session, I think it's also important to note that we can't ignore the impact, the increasingly dangerous international situation, both in its own terms and for the importance of that situation to the struggle for socialism here in Britain. Now, the invasion of Ukraine by Putin's oligarch government is of course an unjustified human tragedy that should be condemned and opposed, but we've also seen that large sections of the left have allowed themselves to be co-opted for the continued drive to war and for greater escalation in Ukraine, ignoring the role that the United States, Britain and NATO played in provoking that conflict in the first instance, and their continued role in fuelling that conflict. The only people that profit from war, and from this war in particular as we're seeing, are the arms manufacturers. The victims on both sides, as ever, are working people. We can never side with our own ruling class and their reckless drive to war, and our primary duty as socialists here in Britain is to combat the imperialism of Britain's ruling class. For the same reasons, we also have to oppose the US-led attempts to build a new Cold War against China and all the xenophobic and all the anti-communist propaganda that goes along with that. And that's propaganda that has major implications for us in the battle of ideas. The youth and the working people of Britain and of the world have nothing to gain for the machinations of imperialism, whether that's in Ukraine or in Taiwan or anywhere else. After Corbynism, we can't allow the struggle for peace and solidarity to be watered down, compromised or sidelined. In fact, we need to strengthen it, we need to redouble our efforts, and we need to put it right at the heart of our movement. In the context of all of this, there's never been a greater or a more urgent need to combat the malign ruling class propaganda for the state and for the monopoly media, and also the growing influence of right-wing misinformation and conspiracy theories online that prey on alienation, particularly among young people. And in that context, that's why the Morning Star and a left alternative in the media that's worker-owned, worker-controlled, is so vital, it's so precious. There's also never been a more urgent need for a strong Communist Party and Young Communist League fighting as part of that broad movement here in Britain. History shows us that when the communist movement's strong, our class is strong, and the class struggle can be fought most vigorously. So, comrades, where do we go from here? Well, we have to go forward, rejecting any complacency about the prospect of a Keir Starmer victory. We have to keep building this wave of industrial militancy and building the labour movement and the other organisations of the class struggle into the force that they need to be, not just to defeat this Tory government, but to put Britain on the socialist path. Confidence in the struggle, comrades, confidence in socialism.
The ideas and principles Jeremy Corbyn inspired are stronger now than they have been for decades. They are trying to rewrite history, but the establishment was shaken to its very core. Such was the power of Corbynism. And I say that as somebody who'd spent 30 years almost in the Labour Party and seen quite a number of transitions. The firm's stand against austerity and the desire for fundamental transformational change was clear. The policies of Corbynism was popular, from renationalisation of key industries, energy, water, rail, to name but a few, to the refounding of our NHS to put it back into full public ownership alongside a national care system free at the point of use was absolutely clear from Corbynism. We can never forgive, however, or forget the fact that Corbynism and ultimately socialism would have won the 2017 election were it not for the saboteurs directly within the party. They were playing in the cesspit and literally crawling in the gutter, trying to prevent a socialist prime minister and ultimately a socialist government. The political elite, alongside the right-wing media, engaged in a ceaseless war of misinformation and demonisation of Corbyn and our movement. Such was that fear for the defeat of capitalism. The three nexus of power, the political, business and media elite, all united in their cause to stop Corbyn by any means necessary. They wanted the public to hate, yes, literally hate, the idea of Corbynism. Yet the tens of thousands of young people inspired to join Corbyn's Labour cannot be forgotten, because they are our future. And it would actually be hard for them now to unsee a future which is putting planet and people before profit. They see it, they want it, they demand it. Our investment, therefore, must continue with this agenda. Corbyn's outlook was international, as we know, is socialism. And we are seeing the rise of socialist victories in Latin America and the ongoing battle to defeat British imperialism and colonialism across the world, and the continued growth of socialism in places like Portugal. The exploitation of our class must be defeated, not just here, but internationally. We saw what can happen with the rise of the inspiring Black Lives Matter movement. We all saw that. And we all saw that, perhaps late, but it had developed some years ago, but it came to popular conscience in a manner that we all saw and witnessed. And that meant the rise of that movement here in the UK too. When we look at our world today, a world in which half of global wealth belongs to the richest 1%, a world in which global and regional inequalities are defined by racialized violence and extraction, we actually see another historical period defined by what Marx called in terms of the language of the oppressor and oppressed. Here in the UK, racial, class and regional inequalities have only deepened after decades of brutal, unrestrained neoliberal policies. Our movement for a socialist future must continue to tackle this. We cannot give up. With industrial militancy on the rise, we must continue to celebrate everything that workers and trade unions have won. From fairer pay to weekends, everything that makes the lives of workers tolerable has been won by generations of struggle. The exploitation of garment workers in Leicester, and in my constituency of Leicester East in particular, is an extreme microcosm of the national and global decay of workers' rights during the failed neoliberal project of the last 40 years. The Tories and sections of big business argue that the mistreatment of workers is inevitable, that rights, fair pay and dignity in the workplace are on an acceptable cost to their bottom line. Yet their free market race to the bottom has normalised poverty, hopelessness and exploitation in our communities. We on the left, together in solidarity, must stop this. We have to be prepared to take on the billionaire brands and retailers. Corbynism has opened our eyes and we cannot now close them. The rapacious, extractive capitalism is incompatible with a sustainable future. The climate crisis lays bare the delusion of moderate politics being the safe, sensible option. Only rapid, radical collective action will give us a chance of defending vulnerable communities in the global south and allow our children to have a livable future and be able to inherit a livable planet. We have to recognise that the role of socialist leaders is not to mediate an unjust system, but to radically transform it. The crisis we actually face requires a radical solution. We stand on the precipice in which the crisis of climate breakdown, rampant racial inequality, and the shockingly uneven distribution of wealth seems irreversible. It cannot be the case that we can live in Britain today, where in my constituency of Leicester East, the average national wage is 21,000. The average wage is 21,000, when nationally it's 32,000. That cannot be right. Yet as socialists, we know there is an alternative, that it is possible to build a society around the needs of all its citizens and the principles of solidarity. As Tony Benn said, actually there's no final victory and no final defeat. The struggle continues, and it's not called a struggle for nothing. But now it is a struggle to ensure that our ideas, already strong in the psyche of the public, are not drowned but instead grow further until the inevitable change takes place before the political classes have done even more damage. Contrary to the elite's preferred narrative, the UK is a fertile field for those socialist principles. And if we allow the powers that be to hide them, it will be right-wing extremism that fills the void it creates. And as we have seen with the Tory government's war on refugees, we cannot ever ever give in to fascism of any kind. Not now, not tomorrow, not ever. We cannot allow that to happen. So we have to roll up our sleeves. We have to rework and hone our tools. And where they do not exist yet, we have to create them and dig those channels that will irrigate those ideas so that they can continue to come to fruition. And because it's International Women's Month, indeed International Women's Week, and because I've not long had my birthday on International Women's Day, I want to end with this because I'm happy to add to this panel, but I want to end with this. It's a helpful reminder from Angela Davis. She said, "I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept." Comrades, my friends, we are not going anywhere.
One of the weaknesses of the Labour Party under Corbyn, which meant that so much was lost so quickly, was that there was a progressive political surge, but there wasn't an industrial surge at the same time. What we've got now is pretty much the opposite. We've got a surge of industrial struggle, but we've got a political retreat by Labour. The Communist Party's belief is that radical change is only going to happen when we manage to get both together. So that idea of struggle within Parliament, outside, and so on is inherent to radical change. So I am going to be critical of the Labour Party, but I don't do this from a position of any sort of moral superiority. I was a member of the Labour Party from 1981 to 1998, and I held various fairly senior positions within the Labour Party, constituency chairs, county chair, and so on. But I came to that joining the Labour Party through my involvement as a trade union shop steward. So I'd been shop steward in a number of companies by that time, and it was just a logical extension of trade union work. And that's the feature that's unique to the Labour Party. It's different to other social democratic parties in Europe and indeed around the world. It's also why the electoral impact of the Communist Party in this country has been less than in some other parts of the world, because there's been an organised working class party based on trade unions that has led the left. So we need to look at that link. Historically and constitutionally, because that link is still there. Most of the major trade unions are still affiliated to the Labour Party. And there are some who are arguing that that should change, that should be disaffiliation, and there will be things that come up at trade union conferences, including Unite's policy conference later this year. But realistically, the chances of any of that changing in the near future are very small. So it's pretty certain that in the immediate future, the organised working class through the trade unions are going to be still affiliated to the Labour Party. And that needs to be part of the considerations when we look at wider left strategy. There is a disconnect between the Labour Party and the working class. There are a couple of examples of that. In Unite's recent, fairly recent, General Secretary election, the successful candidate Sharon Graham focused on back to the workplace and moving away from getting involved in Westminster politicking. And that really struck a chord. It's a genuinely widespread feeling amongst Unite members and activists that dabbling in Westminster politics is diverting from action in the workplace. And that's why Sharon Graham won, and that's the concentration of the union now. But that doesn't mean that the union's political work goes away completely. That is still there, and the chances of Unite disaffiliating are extremely remote. Another of that disconnect between the Labour Party and the working class. And this isn't just about Labour under Starmer. To an extent that happened under Corbyn, but that wasn't Jeremy Corbyn's fault. It's just the way that things went at the time. Is what happens during the 2019 general election. The Communist Party's slogan for that election was vote Labour everywhere. And so I went and helped out in Kingswood, which is, I live on the border between Kingswood and Bristol East, so I'm just in Bristol East. But I helped out in Kingswood. There were masses of Labour canvassers, but almost all of them came from outside of Kingswood. Kingswood's a predominantly working class area on the eastern edge of Bristol. But there were very few people from Kingswood involved in that campaign. Most of them came from other parts of Bristol, the more middle class bits, and from surrounding areas from Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, and so on. Because I was one of the very few people who knew my way around, I just drove them to the different places and told them what to do and how to do things. But there was a complete mismatch between the people who were doing the canvassing and the working class of Kingswood. It was like they were talking two different languages. There was a particular little estate of elderly people's dwellings that I took a group to, which used to be absolutely rock solid Labour. All you had to do was to get somebody with a megaphone and tell them all to get out and vote, and they would do it. The apathy and the confusion, the disengagement of the working class in that area was quite staggering. It was a minority of people who were actually going to vote, and a minority of people who were going to vote Labour. The result in Kingswood was that the Tory majority doubled. The result in Bristol West, which is the most middle class area of Bristol, meant that the Labour majority doubled. It's one of the biggest Labour majorities in the country. If there was an election tomorrow, the Tories would probably still hang on to Kingswood, such was the size of their majority. In Bristol West, the Greens would almost certainly win. Almost every councillor in Bristol West is now a Green, and that's because the people who were enthused by Corbyn's leadership have become disaffected, and the vast majority, not just of activists, but of people in that area, are now supporting the Greens, and I'm sure that the Greens would win an election in that constituency tomorrow. So those are the things that we need to bear in mind. So the idea of building a new party solely on the social base of Corbynism is doomed to failure. The issue for the left is working class engagement in areas like Kingswood. The working class is getting stronger industrially at the moment through the strike wave, but if we're serious about radical transformation in favour of the many, as was said in Labour's slogan at the time, we have to work through and with trade unions. Any left strategy has to be based on what best builds class consciousness and then carries that into transformational political action.
It's never just been about one person. What Jeremy and his time as leader of the Labour Party, and actually throughout his parliamentary career, has always been about unity, coming together, organising. And in terms of the Peace and Justice project, as that's our aim, is to bring people together, to unite in the UK and around the world for peace and social justice. So what we do is we work with trade unions, community groups, and the wider Labour movement, and that includes as well our campaign with Samworth Brothers in Leicester. We were very, very grateful to have Claudia join us at an event quite recently, and obviously happy belated birthday, by the way. I won't sing for you, don't worry. As well as that, we've been working again with Sam McCrummers who make Ginsters, Cornish pasties, among a lot of other things, in Cornwall, facilitating gate meetings and events with the Bakers Union. We've also taken on global giants such as Starbucks and Amazon Silence, as well as with other groups such as Organised Now, such as Strike Map, and as part of our sort of legacy of bringing people together to unite around great causes, great campaigns, and the advancement of workers and their fair treatment. Next month, as well as that, a big part of Jeremy Corbyn's time as leader of the Labour Party was about bringing people together just outside of Westminster, bringing people together for their talents, bringing people together for expression, for art. And that's why next month we're delighted to be launching our Music for the Many campaign, which will be with the aim of protecting music venues as well as and creative spaces, defending the arts, fighting for greater funding and ensuring greater opportunity for marginalised communities and people who may not otherwise have the opportunity to get involved in the arts. Art can be incredibly powerful. Think of how many great bands, how many great social events, Glastonbury and its legacy have come about from sort of radical beginnings. And if we take away those creative spaces where we can nurture that talent, then that's really for us like the last bastion of expression and getting people involved right outside of boring Westminster debates. And that's kind of one thing that I've learned, I think, over my time, not just being involved with the project, but I'm also a councillor and done some local activism in my hometown, which is Huntingdon, if anybody's been, which is in sort of like suburban Cambridgeshire. Thing I've learned is that where it's all very well and good, making great and powerful speeches in Parliament, and certainly there have been some amazing speeches made over the years. But really, I think for me, and what the project's aim shows is that these fights aren't necessarily always won in Westminster. These fights, they start and they end out on the streets. I mean, look where I've just come today from a massive march for the NHS. Absolutely freezing, but that hasn't stopped thousands of people mobilising and fighting for our NHS, the principle of universal healthcare for all who need it in this country, and resisting Tory and private vulture company influence in our hospitals. We've also had in recent months great marches and great demonstrations against racism. We've stopped deportations, we've stopped evictions and unscrupulous landlord practices up and down the country. And I think, as I said, that shows that a lot of these fights, they can be won, and maybe sometimes they can be lost, but I think more often than not can be won on the streets and not just in the chambers. There is a space for everybody, and that's what the project facilitates and nurtures, is that space. We've been on picket lines from unions, with unions from the RMT, railway workers, ASLEF, TSSA, educators in the NEU, the UCU, all of the unions in between, standing with every worker and pushing back no matter how big or small their dispute has been. And there has been some excellent wins lately from unions, such as the Fire Brigades Union, and there's been some great negotiations also with the RMT, who are taking the government's latest offer to referendum. Those things would not have been achieved, and those things were never possible unless there was that great mobilisation. Despite media attacks, the public remained on side with the unions, with the workers, because they've done such a great job in showing that a win for one worker is a win for all workers. They represent every single one of us. They're our friends, they're our family, they're our neighbours, and we must always stand with them. As well as that, and I mentioned just then, talking about the media pushback against the trade unions, which has backfired. It's been amazing to see intellectual giants like Richard Madeley and Kay Burnley humbled in words by people like Mick Lynch on the television, frankly embarrassing themselves. And I think that shows that the establishment media, the legacy media, are terrified of ordinary working people fighting and winning, for what's right and what's fair for them. So what Peace and Justice Project has done is we've set up news clubs in local communities, which counters the mainstream media narrative and discusses what is in the news in local areas and across the country and around the world, but also importantly what is not in the news, highlighting struggles and issues as they come up. And as well as that, the mainstream media may have removed all sense of rationality in discussions on the war in Ukraine, for example, and has highlighted their own hypocrisy on refugees, whereas obviously it's right and fair that we've taken in refugees and supported that in Ukraine, but it has shown that there is an inherent problem in the media and the government's response to refugees coming from other conflicts, whether they be from Africa or the Middle East. The consent manufactured narrative of mainstream media plays into the hands of war hawks and the arms traders who own them. And that's who we're there to counter. We're the Peace and Justice Project, not funded or backed by the millionaires or the billionaires, and we obviously don't want to be. We rely on small one-off donations or regular donations from thousands of supporters up and down the country. And obviously, if you can, please do check out our website, maybe consider. I know times are tough, but we do obviously need your help to continue with our work around the country and around the world. We also amplify the work of left organisations, from Strike Map to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, as well as from promoting news outlets like Novara Media and of course Morning Star, who have been greatly supportive of our work since our foundation also. It's our work that we've done in regards to strike solidarity, organising and giving a voice to those who need a platform and rooting ourselves across local and international communities that have helped us keep alive the hope for the future and a better world that Corbyn in his leadership years brought to millions of people. Whether or not that fully answers the question, I don't know, but for me certainly, I think in terms of the legacy of the Peace and Justice Project, we very much believe in the people who supported Jeremy and the people who continue to support Jeremy. And everything we do as the project comes from a small office team, but it's always a huge collaboration with many, many supporters, organisations from across the entire labour movement and trade unions, and we couldn't do it without any of those people. So Peace and Justice Project is for the many, and it is by the many,